Good morning everyone. I'm changing the wheel bearings in my RF900. I already did the rear. Unfortunately I've got no footage for it because the SD card that I used to film it was faulty, so I couldn't transfer the footage into my computer, so that's gone. However, with the front, hopefully this is all going to work. So without further ado, let's start. Having the wheel on the ground, not lifted yet, what you've got to do is you've got to loosen a couple of things. So you've got those two little bolts here at the front. I've already pre-loosened them. So just get those two loose. This is a 12mm socket or spanner that you will need for that. That would do just fine. Then you're going to have to remove your calipers. It's cool. Now at that point, when they're hanging, under no circumstances use the front brake lever, because if you squeeze it then the pads will touch each other and you're screwed. You're going to have to dismantle all of it and it's just a bad day. Same thing here. Come on. Okay, second caliper off. And ideally you'd want to hang them on some sort of string, but some people say it's unnecessary. I kind of agree with this. Anyway, now you need to remove that nut here, and that would be what was it, 27mm socket. Now at this point you're going to have to lift the front. There's a couple of ways of doing it. I'm equipped with this ABBA stand with front wheel lift. This is going to make my job a lot easier, but you can just basically put, I don't know, a jack underneath the exhaust pipes and just be lifted up, and that should do. So here we have it. We've got the front in the air, calipers nicely hanging on some ropes. We can now take the wheel off. 22mm socket. And we're going to remove the spindle. So before you actually remove the spindle and take the wheel off, it's a good idea to take a picture with your phone, for instance, and have reference how the speedo drive actually sits here on the left hand side. So this is your speedo drive here, and it's cabled down here. That's it then. Okay, the wheel dropped. So on the other side, which you can't see now, there's going to be the speedo drive. Okay, so now if you just grab it from the bottom, there we go. That's your spindle removed. Get the wheel off. Here we have it then. So the wheel is off the bike. So this is your left hand side, and you will recognize this by those teeth here. This is where the speedo drive sits. Your bearing is exposed pretty much on top of it, and on the other side, which is going to be your right hand side, you're going to have this cover, spacer, whatever you want to call it. So that has to be removed, and we've got the bearing just underneath it. So I'm going to use is just a screwdriver. So what you're doing is you're going to be hammering that bearing over there, the rear bearing, the speedo drive side. Well, that's what I'm going to do first. And what's going to happen is inside here in the spindle hole you've got this spacer, and this spacer moves freely. Can you see this? I can actually change its position. So what you've got to do is you've got to place it in a position where it's going to allow you to put a screwdriver inside and hammer on this part of the bearing on the other side, and that's going to push this bearing outwards, I mean downwards in my case, and that's how we're going to remove it. Hopefully you'll be able to see this. It's going to be rather difficult to capture, but let's have hope. Okay, and you're going to be changing the position of the screwdriver with each tap. because you want to make sure that the bearing comes out squarely. This is an interference fit. It sits there very, very tight, so you wouldn't want to destroy the wheel. Okay, it seems like I'm getting some movement. Let's have a look. There we go. You see this? How the bearing came out? So I guess there's going to be 2, maybe 3 more taps and it's going to be fully out. So now what I'm going to use is this old extension because it's got the bigger contact surface here, so I'm going to be able to there we go. Bearing's out. So this is the spacer I was talking about. It sits just inside there. So you see this? This is a spacer that sits just inside there, and this is the bearing. And what I was hitting on was that inner part of the bearing just to get it out. There we go. We've got it out. So now we turn it over, and now we get another bearing out. Okay, so this is going to be somewhat easy now, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to place this extension inside, and I'm going to be tapping alternately this here, then this here, then this here, then this here, then this here, this here, this here, this here. I'm going to be changing the position of it, and I'm going to be doing it until the bearing comes out. There we go. It came out nicely. Here we have it. Okay then, so according to service manual, you've got to install the left bearing first. So obviously the left bearing is the side with those teeth here for Speedo's drive. And I got those coil bearings on eBay. Okay, so before you actually start hammering your bearing in, you can use a tiny amount of grease and get this surface here inside the wheel slightly smeared with grease. Put the bearing on. And by the way, a tiny little tip: if somehow you got those type of bearings which are exposed on one side, the seal part has to be the outer part. You can't install it like this. It always has to go like that. You can actually use your old bearing, put it on top of it, and hammer that one in. Let's magnify it a bit. A couple more taps. Let's have a look. We're getting very close. A couple more taps. Okay, I think I'm good now, and you can actually hear the sound. So that's what it looks like. So this outer race is flush with this here, and that's how we want it. Alright, then let's turn it around. There we go. Okay, so before I put the second bearing in, don't forget about inserting the spacer back in, so that goes in just like that. But before you put it in, make sure there is no any signs of damage over here. This area here should be nice and smooth. If it's not, it can possibly start catching on the inner race of the bearing, and in extreme cases lead to the premature wear of the bearing. You can put some grease inside. This is of course where the spindle will go in. So I guess some little amount of grease inside there wouldn't harm at all. Alright, let's check this in. There we go. And same as before, some tiny amount of grease here, which will help driving the new bearing inside. And the new bearing. So, same as before, I'm going to use the old bearing.
A few moments later.
Now this is very important. When do you stop tapping the new bearing in? So obviously you've got this spacer inside. Hopefully you'll be able to see it moving. Can you see it moving? So you've got this spacer inside, okay? And there's a bit of a gap between the spacer and the bearing. You see this here? That little gap over here? You still have to have a tiny microscopic gap left, because you don't want this spacer inside start rubbing hard on this inner race of the bearing. So I would say maybe, I don't know, 1/2 millimeter or even 1/3 of the millimeter would be okay as a gap. Basically every now and again have a little look and make sure that the gap doesn't become too small. I'm gonna switch onto this extension and I'm gonna try to tap on the outer race, positioning my extension like that. There's that gap in there, still a bit big. Right, I think I'm just about there. So now this spacer inside can still move freely, but the gap between the inner race of this bearing and the face of this spacer is, I would say, it's probably about literally like 1/2 millimeter. Okay then, so that's job done, both bearings installed. Pretty simple job. However, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to remove the brake discs, simply because I don't think there was a video on that for RF900 on YouTube, so I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to paint the carriers to make the bike look a bit more interesting. So all bolts loosened up. Now I'm just going to grab a ratchet, and that should now go pretty easily. Now I'm putting the disc back on. So I did 2 little jobs with the discs and bolts. So first of all, I painted the carrier. It looks just beautiful. Have a look at this. And also I polished those bolts. So now they are nice and shiny. So before we put the bolts on, you need to use a bit of a Loctite. You could just maybe smear it a bit like that. That should be enough. Okay peeps, so now it's time for torque range. Those have to be torqued down to 23 Newton meters according to Suzuki's manual. That's 23. And this is 23 as well. Brilliant. And this as well. And this as well. Beautiful. Just one more tip, when you put your brake discs on, remember that each disc has to go on the correct side. So just on the disc here, you're gonna see a little letter L. Hopefully you'll be able to see this. Can you see that letter L here? There's a letter L, and that means left. And obviously on the other side, there's gonna be a letter R here, which stands for right. Okay, so let's not forget about this little cover, which will go on the right hand side. There we go. Let's try to put it on. Come on. Okay, so it seems like got the spindle going through. There we go. You see the spindle coming through here? That means it grabbed it nicely. So if you have a look, the spindle just came through. My speedo drive is nicely engaged on those teeth. And you now should see the threads coming through that side. Okay. So let me just show you what happens on the other side. So here's what I'm doing here. There we go. And that's it, that's the limit. It wouldn't go any further. You'd grab your nut, put it on here. Your speedo drive isn't moving and it's in the right position, so the wheel is spinning nicely and freely. There is no dodgy sounds. It's just ideal, that's what we want. Alright, so now you're going to want to put your brake calipers on. Well, these two bolts, they need to be torqued down to 39 Newton meters, so torque wrench is something that you have to use. There we go. Okay, so as you probably noticed, I haven't done anything with those two, and also I haven't torqued down the axle nut and the axle itself. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to lower the front now, so the whole weight of the bike rests as normal on the front wheel, and then we're going to settle the forks, and then we're going to tighten all those bolts up. As you probably noticed, I haven't done anything with those two yet. Keep them loose for a moment, because what you've got to do is you've got to torque down your axle to 100 Newton meters. So for that you're going to use the bigger torque range. There we go, that's 100. Now go on the left hand side, same thing with the axle nut, it will need 100 Newton meters as well. Now finally make sure that you settle your forks correctly. Once your forks have been settled, you can finally tighten those two bolts. Okay, don't go ridiculous with torque on those two because it's quite easy to strip them. So that is it, job done.